All right, in this lesson, we're going to learn how to create an ice tree, which will allow us to simulate kind of a large bank of clouds in the sky. Okay, so I'm going to be starting with just a blank scene in this case. Now, thinking about this a little bit, where we have a situation where we want to make kind of a large bank of clouds and we have a lot of individual clouds, we probably don't want to make a separate ice emitter for every single cloud. So what we can actually do is create just one single emitter, but tell it to only emit particles in certain areas. So that's what we'll use to create kind of this large bank of clouds very easily using just one object. So we can start really with anything. I'll start with just a grid in my case. All right, switch this to shaded view and scale this out so that it covers a relatively decent area. Okay, now once we have this, let's go to ice, create, and emit particles from selection. I'll give this just a moment. Okay, and now when we play this back, we have our particles that are emitting from this surface. Now let's go ahead and start to make a few minor adjustments to this. So I'm going to open up the ice tree, just Alt-9 on my keyboard. Okay, so let's start by going into the emit from surface node. Let's change this from points to maybe spheres. All right, rewind this, and you can see our spheres are pretty small. So let's come in and try to adjust the size of these. So I'll turn on my looping for this and maybe give myself a few more frames so I can actually simulate this. So let's go in, maybe change the size, start with something like 1. It's probably a little bit too small still. Maybe something like 3, because I want to get a relatively decent coverage of these particles. Okay, so far so good. Now, instead of actually having these particles emit evenly across the entire surface, what we could do is plug in just a simple black and white texture map and then use the black and white information on that to just have these particles emit in certain areas. So we need to hook this up in the ice tree. So again, using your search function, this is really valuable. If you don't know the exact node that you're looking for, let's say we know it has something to do with a texture and wanting to emit particles based on some kind of a texture. So if we type in texture, you can see it gives us a few results, and it actually gives us the one that we are looking for, which is filter by texture map. Now, this is something that's really important. What we have to do in order for this filter by texture map to work properly is we have to make sure that there is a texture map on our grid object. So let me go back and select this grid. And the way in which we apply this texture map is very important. We don't necessarily apply this to the Phong material in the render tree. Instead, what we need to do is select this grid, go up to Get Property, or we could actually get it from this menu as well, Get Property, and we need to select a texture map. All right, now once we do that, we can go in and choose the image that we want to use. So let's go to New from File. All right, and if you take a look inside the Pictures directory of the project that we're currently working out of, we should see a texture in here called Filter by Texture. So let's click on that, and you can see this is really just a very simple black and white image. So once we connect this up, what will happen is these ice particles will be emitted from these areas of dark color. These areas of white, we won't have any sort of particles emitted from these areas. And where we have sort of these gray areas in between, we'll get just kind of sporadic particles kind of scattered throughout. So this is a really quick way of just kind of getting a random scattering of particles, but still making sure that we have them in sort of a controlled area. Okay, now once we have this connected up, what we should see in this grid, if we go into the Selection Explorer, is a texture map. And this is really important to make sure that we have it connected in this way. So now, let's go back to our ice tree. All right, we'll use Filter by Texture Map, drop that in, and as long as we have the texture connected up in the Selection Explorer, or connected properly, we should have this node that comes in with a green coloration, so everything is working properly. If we have not connected the texture map properly back on our grid, this node will actually come in red. So, to filter by texture map, let's plug this on Execute on Emit. Let's rewind and play this back, and it still really is not working properly. All right, so before this will work, one thing that is very important for us to do is to actually go into the texture map, and make sure that we have this projecting on the surface correctly. So go into UV property, let's go to new, and let's go with a planar XZ, which should project this straight down, and we can actually see the texture support that's been created for us right here. So that is being projected on this surface properly. So now that we have that, we can see the correct effect, where we have just these particles that are being emitted just in this one small little area. Okay, now let's go back and start to refine the movement and some of the attributes found in here. So let's start by just raising up maybe the rate of our particle emission, because you can see right now we are not getting a very good coverage of particles, at least not very quickly. So let's come in and maybe raise this up a little bit higher. The emission rate, something like 200. It looks like we could probably even stand to go maybe a little bit higher. Okay, that's a little bit better. Now let's try to add a little bit of variety to some of the sizes of these particles, because right now they're all the exact same size. So I'm just trying to kind of come in and add a lot of randomization in this just to get something that looks a little bit more natural. So let's try something like turbulize around value. So I'll just type in TURB, turbulize around value, and we'll plug this into the size. So as far as the base value, looks like a value of 3 was working pretty good, which was the particle size that we had set over here. And we'll give it a variance of something like 1. So that way we get pretty decent variety. Let's see what that does for us. Okay. So a nice kind of mix of different size particles in here. Let's also maybe change up some of the movements of these. So you can see right now as we play these back, these particles are all moving at the exact same speed in the exact same direction, which once we start to create our cloud bank is going to create a very flattened top. So a lot of clouds will have a flattened bottom, but for a flattened top that may not be the best look. So let's use another turbulize around value node. We'll plug this into the speed. All right, we'll give this, well, let's say a base value of maybe 1 or 2. Let's just see what this does for us. All right, so it's a little bit better. Let's maybe even knock that base value down to something like 1. So now you can see we get a little bit more variation in the actual movement and the speed of these particles. And that should help us to create a little bit more of an irregular top to these clouds. All right, so that should give us a pretty good starting point for the actual cloud bank. So if we were to come in here and maybe just hide this grid, now we have kind of a decent bank of clouds up here that are sort of scattered about. And we could make this filter by texture, or this texture that we're using, as complex or as large as we want to. So if we needed even more clouds to cover a little bit larger area, we could do that as well. Again, just using one emitter and one texture. So now that we have these particles set up and at a relatively decent starting point for kind of a nice cloud bank, what we can start to do in our next lesson is begin the process of lighting and rendering these clouds.